that he was about to leave England, and observed what an excellent and promising scheme it seemed to be. "Yes, it is a likely scheme enough, in a commercial sense, no doubt," he replied. "But, my dear Mercy, it snaps the continuity of existence. Perhaps a cloister would be preferable." "A cloister? Oh, Angel Clare!" "Well, why, you wicked man, a cloister implies a monk, and a monk Roman Catholicism. And Roman Catholicism sin, and sin damnation. Thou art in perilous state, Angel Clare." "I glory in my Protestantism," she said severely. Then Clare, thrown by the sheer misery into one of the demoniacal moods in which man does, despite to its true principles, called her close to him, and fiendishly whispered in her ear the most heterodox ideas he could think of. His momentary laughter at the horror which appeared on her fair face ceased when it emerged in pain and anxiety for his welfare. "Dear Mercy," he said, "you must forgive me. I think I am going crazy." She thought that he was, and thus the interview ended, and Clare re-entered the vicarage. With the local banker he deposited the jewels till happier days should arise. He also paid into the bank £30 to be sent to Tess in a few months, as she might require, and wrote to her at her parents' home in Blackmore Vale to inform her of what he had done. This amount, with the sum he had already placed in her hands, about £50, he hoped would be amply sufficient for her wants just at present, particularly as, in an emergency, she had been directed to apply to his father. He deemed it best not to put his parents into communication with her by informing them of her address, and, being unaware of what had really happened to estrange the two, neither his father nor his mother suggested that he should do so. During the day he left the parsonage, for what he had to complete he wished to get done quickly. As the last duty before leaving this part of England, it was necessary for him to call at the Wellbridge farmhouse, in which he had spent with Tess the first 3 days of their marriage, the trifle of rent having to be paid, the key given up for the 2 rooms they had occupied, and 2 or 3 small articles fetched away that they had left behind. It was under this roof that the deepest shadow ever thrown upon his life had stretched its gloom over him. Yet, when he had unlocked the door of the sitting room and looked into it, the memory which returned first upon him was that of their happy arrival on a similar afternoon, the first fresh sense of sharing a habitation conjointly, the first meal together, the chatting by the fire with joined hands. The farmer and his wife were in the fields at the moment of his visit, and Clare was in the rooms alone for some time. Inwardly swollen with a renewal of sentiments that he had not quite reckoned with, he went upstairs to her chamber, which had never been his. The bed was smooth, as she had made it with her own hands on the morning of leaving. The mistletoe hung under the tester just as he had placed it. Having been there 3 or 4 weeks, it was turning colour, and the leaves and berries were wrinkled. Angel took it down and crushed it into the grate. Standing there, he, for the first time, doubted whether his course in this conjuncture had been a wise, much less a generous one. But had he not been cruelly blinded? In the incoherent multitude of his emotions, he knelt down at the bedside and wept. "Oh, Tess, if you had only told me sooner, I would have forgiven you," he said. Hearing a footstep below, he rose and went to the top of the stairs. saw a woman standing, and, on her turning up her face, recognised the pale, dark-eyed is Hewitt. "Mr. Clare," she said, "I've called to see you and Mrs. Clare, and to inquire if ye be as well as can be expected." This was a girl whose secret he had guessed, but who had not yet guessed his. An honest girl who loved him, who would have made as good, or nearly as good, a practical farmer's wife as Tess. "I am here alone," he said. "We are not living here now." Explaining why he had come, he asked, "Which way are you going home, Is?" "I have no home at Albany's Dairy now, sir," she said. "Why is that?" Is looked down. "It was so dismal there that I left. I'm staying out this way." She pointed in a contrary direction, the direction in which he was journeying. "Well, are you going there now? I can take you if you wish for a lift." Her olive complexion grew richer in hue. "Thank ye, Mr. Clare," she said. He soon found the farmer and settled the account for his rent and a few other items which had to be considered by reason of the sudden abandonment of the lodgings. On Clare's return to his horse and gig, Is jumped up beside him. "I am going to leave England, Is," he said, as they drove on. "Going to Brazil." "And do Mrs. Clare like the notion of such a journey?" she asked. "She's not going at present, say for a year or so. I am going out to reconquire, to see what life there is like." They sped along eastward for some considerable distance, Is making no observation. "How are the others?" he inquired. "How is Retty?" "She is in a sort of nervous state, and so thin and hollow-cheeked that I do seem in a decline. Nobody will ever fall in love with her any more," said Is absently. "And Marianne?" Is lowered her voice. "Marianne drinks." "Indeed." "Yes. The dairyman says he must get rid of her." "And you?" "I don't drink, and I am not in a decline. But I know great things at singing before breakfast now." "How is that? Do you remember how neatly you used to turn? 'Twas down at Cupid's Gardens, and the tailor's breeches at morning milking." "Ah, yes. When you first came, sir, that was. Not when you had been there a bit." "Why was that falling off?" Her black eyes flashed up to his face for one moment by way of answer. Is, "Yes, I understand," he said kindly, and fell into reverie. "Then, I suppose I had asked you to marry me." "If you had, I should have said yes. And you would have married a woman who loved ye." "Really?" "Down to the ground," she whispered. "Oh my God, did you never guess it till now?" By and by they reached a branch road to a village. "I must get down. I live out there," said Is abruptly, never having spoken since her avowal. Clare slowed the horse. He was incensed against his fate, bitterly disposed towards social ordinances. They had cooped him up in a corner out of which there was no legitimate pathway. Why not be revenged on society by rolling his future domesticities himself, instead of kissing the pedagogical rod of convention in his lonely manner? "I am going to Brazil alone, Is," said he. "I've separated from my wife for personal, not voyaging, reasons. I may never live with her again. Will you go with me instead of her?" "Do you truly wish me to go?" "I do. I have been badly used enough to wish for relief, and you at least love me disinterestedly." You will. You know what it means is, it means that I shall be with you for the time you are over there. That's good enough for me. Remember, you are not to trust me in morals now, but I ought to remember you that it will be wrongdoing in the eyes of civilization, Western civilization, that is to say. I don't mind that. No woman do when it comes to agony point, and there's no other way. Then don't get down, but sit where you are. He drove past the crossroads, 1 mile, 2 miles, without showing any signs of affection. You love me very, very much, is? He suddenly asked. I do. I have said I do. I loved you all the time we was at the dairy together. More than Tess. She shook her head. No, she murmured. Not more than she. How's that? Because nobody could love E more than Tess did. She would have laid down her life free. I could do no more. Like the prophet at the top of Boar, is Hewitt would fain have spoken perversely at such a moment, but the fascination exercised over her rougher nature by Tess's character compelled her to grace. Clare was silent, his heart had risen at those straightforward words from such an unexpected, unimpeachable quarter. In his throat was something as if a sob had solidified there. His ears repeated, she would have laid down her life free. I could do no more. Forget our idle talk, is, he said, turning the horse's head suddenly. I don't know what I have been saying. I will now drive you back to where your lane branches off. So much for honesty towards E. Oh, how can I bear it? How can I? How can I? Is Hewitt burst into wild tears and beat her forehead as she saw what she had done. Do you regret that poor little act of justice to an absent one? Oh, Is, don't spoil it by regret. She stilled herself by degrees. Very well, sir. Perhaps I didn't know what I was saying either when I agreed to go. I wish what cannot be. Because I have a loving wife already. Yes, yes, you have. They reached the corner of the lane, which they had passed half an hour earlier, and she hopped down. You will forget my momentary levity, he said. It was ill-considered, ill-advised. Forget it. Never, never. Oh, it was no levity to me. He felt how richly he deserved the reproach that the wounded cry conveyed, and, in a sorrow that was inexpressible, leapt down and took her hand. Well, but, Is, we'll part friends, anyhow. You don't know what I have had to bear. She was a really generous girl, and allowed no further bitterness to mar their adieu. I forgive ye, sir, she said. Now, Is, he said solemnly, while she stood beside him there, I want you to tell Marianne, when you see her, that she is to be a good woman, and not to give way to folly. Promise that, and tell Retty that there are more worthy men than I in the world, that for my sake she is to act wisely and well. Remember the words, wisely and well. For my sake, I send this message to them as a dying man to the dying, for I shall never see them more. And you, Izzy, you have saved me by your honest words about my wife from an incredible impulse towards folly and treachery. Women may be bad, but they are not so bad as men in these things. On that one account, I can never forget you. Be always the good and sincere girl you have hitherto been, and think of me as a worthless lover, but a true friend. Promise. She gave the promise gravely. Heaven bless and keep you, sir. Goodbye. was not for Is. That evening he was within a featherweight's turn of abandoning his road to the nearest station and driving across the elevated dorsal line of South Wessex towards his Tess's home. It was neither a contempt for her nature nor the probable state of her heart which deterred him. No, it was a sense that, despite her love, as corroborated by Is's admission, the facts had not changed. If he was right at first, he was right now, and the momentum of the course on which he had embarked tended to keep him going in it, unless diverted by a stronger, more sudden force than had played out this afternoon. He would soon come back to her. He took the train that night for London, and 5 days after shook hands in farewell of his brothers at the port of embarkation. Chapter 41. From the foregoing events of the winter time, let us press on to an October day, more than 8 months subsequent to the parting of Claire and Tess. We discover the latter in changed conditions. Instead of a bride with boxes and trunks, which others bore, we see her, a lonely woman with a basket and a bundle in her own porterage, as at an earlier time when she was no bride. Instead of the ample means that were anticipated by her husband for her comfort through this probationary period, she can produce only a flattened purse. After again leaving Marlow, her home, she had got through the spring and summer without any great stress upon her physical powers, the time being mainly spent in rendering light, irregular service at dairy work near Port Bredy, to the west of the Blackmore Valley. Equally remote from her native place and from Talbot's, she preferred this to living on his allowance. Mentally, she remained in utter stagnation, a condition which the mechanical occupation rather fostered than checked. Her consciousness was at that other dairy, at that other season, in the presence of the tender lover who had confronted her there. He who, the moment she had grasped him to keep him for her own, had disappeared like a shape in a vision. The dairy work lasted only till the milk began to lessen, for she had not met with a second regular engagement as at Talbot's, but had done duty as a supernumerary only. However, as harvest was now beginning, she had simply to remove from the pasture to the stubble to find plenty of further occupation, and this continued till harvest was done. Of the £25 which had remained to her of Claire's allowance, after deducting the other half of the 50 as a contribution to her parents for the trouble and expense to which she had put them, she had as yet spent but little. But there now followed an unfortunate interval of wet weather, during which she was obliged to fall back upon her sovereigns. She could not bear to let them go. Angel had put them into her hand, had obtained them bright and new from his bank for her. His touch had consecrated them to souvenirs of himself. They appeared to have had, as yet, no other history than such as was created by his and her own experiences, and to disperse them was like giving away relics. But she had to do it, and one by one they left her hands. She had been compelled to send her mother her address from time to time, but she concealed her circumstances. When her money had almost gone, a letter from her mother reached her. Joan stated that they were in dreadful difficulty. The autumn rains had gone through the thatch of the house, which required entire ceiling upstairs were also required, which, with the previous bill, would amount to a sum of £20. As her husband was a man of means, and had doubtless returned by this time, could she not send them the money? Tess had £30 coming to her almost immediately from Angel's bankers, and, the case being so deplorable, as soon as the sum was received, she sent the 20 as requested. Part of the remainder she was obliged to expend in winter clothing, leaving only a nominal sum for the whole inclement season at hand. When the last pound had gone, a remark of Angel's that, whenever she required further resources, she was to apply to his father, remained to be considered. But the more Tess thought of the step, the more reluctant was she to take it. The same delicacy, pride, false shame, whatever it may be called, on Claire's account, which had led her to hide from her own parents the prolongation of the estrangement, hindered her in owning to his that she was in want after the fair allowance he had left her. They probably despised her already. How much more they would despise her in the character of a mendicant. The consequence was that, by no effect, could the parson's daughter-in-law bring herself to let him know her state. Her reluctance to communicate with her husband's parents might, she thought, lessen with the lapse of time, but with her own the reverse obtained. On her leaving their house after the short visit subsequent to her marriage, they were under the impression that she was ultimately going to join her husband, and from that time to the present she had done nothing to disturb their belief that she was awaiting his return in comfort, hoping against hope that his journey to Brazil would result in a short stay only, after which he would come to fetch her, or that he would write for her to join him. In any case, that they would soon present a united front to their families and the world. This hope she still fostered. To let her parents know that she was a deserted wife, dependent now that she had relieved their necessities on her own hands for a living, after the éclat of a marriage which was to nullify the collapse of the first attempt, would be too much indeed. The set of brilliants returned to her mind. Where Claire deposited them she did not know, and it mattered little. If it were true that she could only use and not sell them, even were they absolutely hers, it would be passing mean to enrich herself by a legal title to them which was not essentially hers at all. Meanwhile, her husband's days had been by no means free from trial. At this moment he was lying ill of fever in the clay land near Curitiba in Brazil, having been drenched with thunderstorms and persecuted by other hardships, in common with all the English farmers and farm labourers who, just at this time, were deluded into going thither by the promises of the Brazilian government, and by the baseless assumption that those frames which, ploughing and sowing on English uplands, had resisted all the weathers to whose moods they had been born, could resist equally well all the weathers by which they were surprised on Brazilian plains. To return, thus, it happened that when the last of Tess's sovereigns had been spent, she was unprovided with others to take their place. On account of the season, she found it increasingly difficult to get employment. Not being aware of the rarity of intelligence, energy, health, and willingness in any sphere of life, she refrained from seeking an indoor occupation, fearing towns, large houses, people of means and social sophistication, and of manners other than rural. From that direction of gentiality, black care had come. Society might be better than she supposed, from her slight experience of it. But she had no proof of this, and her instinct in the circumstances was to avoid its purlieus. The small dairies in which she had served as supernumerary milkmaid during the spring and summer required no further aid. The harvest was over. Room would probably have been made for her at Tabithy's, if only out of sheer compassion, but comfortable as her life had been there, she could not go back. The anticlimax would be too intolerable, and her return might bring reproach upon her idolized husband. She could not have borne their pity and their whispered remarks to one another upon her strange situation, though she would almost have faced a knowledge of her circumstances by every individual there, so long as her story had remained isolated in the mind of each. It was the interchange of ideas about her that made her sensitiveness wince. Tess could not account for this distinction. She simply knew that she felt it. She was now on her way to an upland farm in the centre of the county, to which she had been recommended by a wandering letter which had reached her from Marianne. Marianne had somehow heard that Tess was separated from her husband, probably through Is Hewitt, and the good-natured and now tippling girl, deeming Tess in trouble, had hastened to notify to her former friend that she herself had gone to this upland spot after leaving the dairy, and would like to see her there, where there was room for other hands, if it was really true that she worked again as of old. With the shortening of the days, all hope of obtaining her husband's forgiveness began to leave her, and there was something of the habitude of the wild animal in the unreflecting instinct with which she rambled on, disconnecting herself by littles from her eventful past at every step, obliterating her identity, giving no thought to accidents or contingencies which might make a quick discovery of her whereabouts by others of importance to her own happiness, if not to theirs. Among the difficulties of her lonely position, not the least was the attention she excited by her appearance, a certain bearing of distinction which she had caught from Claire, being superadded to her natural attractiveness. Whilst the clothes lasted, which had been prepared for her marriage, these casual glances of interest caused her no inconvenience. But as soon as she was compelled to don the wrapper of a field woman, rude words were addressed to her more than once. But nothing occurred to cause her bodily fear till a particular November afternoon. She had preferred the fertile country of the southwest to the upland farm for which she was now bound, because, for one thing, it was nearer to the home of her husband's father, and to hover about that region unrecognized, with the notion that she might decide to call at the vicarage some day, gave her pleasure. But, having once decided to try the higher and drier levels, she pressed on, marching afoot across the village of Chalk Newton, where she meant to pass the night. The lane was long and unvaried, and, owing to the rapid shortening of the days, dusk came upon her before she was aware. She had reached the top of a hill, down which the lane stretched its serpentine length in glimpses, when she heard footsteps behind her back, and, in a few moments, she was overtaken by a man. He stepped up alongside Tess, and said, "Good night, my pretty maid," to which she civilly replied. The light still remaining in the sky lit up her face, though the landscape was nearly dark. The man turned and stared hard at her. "Why, surely, it is the young wench who was at Tantridge a while, young Squire d'Urberville's friend. I was there at that time, though I don't live there now." She recognized him in the well-to-do boor whom Angel had knocked down at the inn for addressing her coarsely. A spasm of anguish shot through her and she returned him no answer. Be honest enough to own it, and that what I said in the town was true, though your fancy man was so up about it. Hey, my sly one, you ought to beg my pardon for that blow of his, considering. Still, no answer came from Tess. There seemed only one escape for her hunted soul. She suddenly took to her heels with the speed of the wind, and, without looking behind her, ran along the road till she came to a gate which opened directly into a plantation. Into this she plunged, and did not pause till she was deep enough in its shade to be safe against any possibility of discovery. Underfoot, the leaves were dry, and the foliage of some holly bushes, which grew among the deciduous trees, were dense enough to keep off draughts. She scraped together the dead leaves till she had formed them into a large heap, making a sort of nest in the middle. Into this Tess crept. Such sleep as she got was naturally fitful. She fancied she heard strange noises, but persuaded herself that they were caused by the breeze. She thought of her husband in some vague, warm clime on the other side of the globe, while she was here in the cold. Was there another such a wretched being as she in the world? Tess asked herself, and, thinking of her wasted life, said, "All is vanity." She repeated the words mechanically till she reflected that this was a most inadequate thought for modern days. Solomon had thought as far as that more than 2,000 years ago. She herself, though not in the van of thinkers, had got much further. If all were only vanity, who would mind it? Alas, all was, alas, worse than vanity. The wife of Angel Clare put her hand to her brow and felt its curve and the edges of her eye sockets as perceptible under the soft skin, and thought as she did so that a time would come when that bone would be bare. "I wish it were now," she said. In the midst of these whimsical fancies, she heard a new, strange sound among the leaves. It might be the wind, yet there was scarcely any wind. Sometimes it was a palpitation, sometimes a flutter, sometimes it was a sort of gasp or gurgle. Soon she was certain that the noises came from wild creatures of some kind, the more so when, originating in the boughs overhead, they were followed by the fall of a heavy body upon the ground. Had she been ensconced here under other and more pleasant conditions, she would have become alarmed, but outside humanity she had at present no fear. Day at length broke in the sky. When it had been day aloft for some while, it became day in the wood. Directly the assuring and prosaic light of the world's active hours had grown strong, she crept from under her hillock of leaves and looked round boldly. Then she perceived what had been going on to disturb her. The plantation wherein she had taken shelter ran down at this spot into a peak, which ended it hitherward, outside the hedge being arable ground. Under the trees several pheasants lay about, their rich plumage dabbled with blood. Some were dead, some feebly moving their wings, some staring up at the sky, some pulsating feebly, some contorted, some stretched out, all of them writhing in agony, except the fortunate ones whose tortures had ended during the night by the inability of nature to bear more. Tess guessed at once the meaning of this. The birds had been driven down into this corner the day before by some shooting party, and while those that had dropped dead under the shot, or had died before nightfall, had been searched for and carried off, many slightly wounded birds had escaped and hidden themselves away, or risen among the thick boughs, where they physician till they grew weaker with the loss of blood in the night time, when they had fallen one by one, as she had heard them. She had occasionally caught glimpses of these men in girlhood, looking over hedges or peering through bushes, and pointing their guns, strangely accutered, a bloodthirsty light in their eyes. She had been told that, rough and brutal as they seemed just then, they were not like this all the year round, but were in fact quite civil persons, save during certain weeks of autumn and winter, when, like the inhabitants of the Malay Peninsula, they ran amok and made it their purpose to destroy life. In this case, harmless feathered creatures, brought into being by artificial means, solely to gratify their propensities. At once so unmannerly and so unchivalrous towards their weaker fellows in nature's teeming family. With the impulse of a soul who could feel for kindred sufferers as much as for herself, Tess's first thought was to put the still living birds out of their torture, and to this end, with her own hands, she broke the necks of as many as she could find, leaving them to lie where she had found them, till the gamekeepers should come, as they probably would, to look for them a second time. Poor darlings, I suppose myself the most miserable being on earth in the presence of such misery as this, she exclaimed, her tears running down as she killed the birds tenderly, and not a twinge of bodily pain about me. I am not mangled, and I am not bleeding, and I have 2 hands to feed and clothe me. She was ashamed of herself for her gloom of the night, based on nothing more tangible than a sense of condemnation under an arbitrary law of society, which had no foundation in nature. Chapter 42. It was now broad day, and she started again, emerging cautiously upon the highway. But there was no need for caution. Not a soul was at hand, and Tess went onward with fortitude, with recollection of the birds' silent endurance of their night of agony impressing upon her the relativity of sorrows and the tolerable nature of her own. If she could once rise high enough to despise opinion, but that she could not do so long as it was held by Claire. She reached Chalk Newton and breakfasted at an inn, where several young men were troublesomely complimentary to her good looks. Somehow she felt hopeful, for was it not possible that her husband might claim her even yet? But she was bound to take care of herself on the chance of it, and keep off lovers. To this end, Tess resolved to run no further risks from her appearance. As soon as she got out of the village, she entered a thicket, and took from her basket one of the old field gowns, which she had never put on even at the dairy, never since she had worked among the stubble at Marlow. She also, by a felicitous thought, took a handkerchief from her bundle and tied it round her face, under her bonnet, covering her chin and half her cheeks and temples, as if she were suffering from toothache. Then, with her little scissors, by the aid of a pocket-looking glass, she mercilessly snipped her eyebrows off, and thus ensured against aggressive admiration, she went on her uneven way. What a moment of a maid, said the next man who met her to a companion. Tears came into her eyes for very pity of herself as she heard him. But I don't care, she said. Oh no, I don't care. I'll always be ugly now, because Angel is not here, and I have nobody to take care of me. My husband, that was, is gone away, and never will love me any more. But I love him just the same, it was bad, but she trudged on. The honesty, directness, and impartiality of elemental enmity disconcerting her but little. Her object being a winter's occupation and a winter's home, there was no time to lose. Her experience of short hirings had been such that she determined to accept no more. Thus, she went forward from farm to farm in the direction of the place whence Marianne had written to her, which she determined to make use of as a last shift only, its rumoured stringencies being the reverse of tempting. First she inquired for the lighter kinds of employment, and, as acceptance in any variety of these grew hopeless, applied next for the less light, till, beginning with the dairy and poultry tendance she liked best, she ended with the heavy and coarse pursuit which she liked least. Work on arable land, work of such roughness, indeed, as she would never have deliberately volunteered for. Towards the second evening, she reached the irregular chalk tableland, or plateau, bosomed with semi-globular tumuli, which stretched between the valley of her birth and the valley of her love. Here the air was dry and cold, and the long cart roads were blown white and dusty again within a few hours after rain. There were few trees, or none, those that would have grown in the hedges being mercilessly plashed down with the quickset by the tenant farmers, the natural enemies of tree, bush, and brake. In the middle distance, ahead of her, she could see the summits of Bulbarrow and of Nettlecombe-tout, and they seemed friendly. They had a low and unassuming aspect from this upland, though, as approached on the other side from Blackmoor in her childhood, they were as lofty bastions against the sky. Southerly, at many miles' distance, and over the hills and ridges, coastward, she could discern a surface like polished steel. It was the English Channel, at a point far out towards France. Before her, in a slight depression, were the remains of a village. She had, in fact, reached Flintcomb-Ash, the place of Marianne's sojourn. There seemed to be no help for it. Hither she was doomed to come. The stubborn soil around her showed plainly enough that the kind of labour in demand here was of the roughest kind. But it was time to rest from searching, and she resolved to stay, particularly as it began to rain. At the entrance to the village was a cottage, whose gable jutted into the road, and, before applying for lodging, she stood under its shelter and watched the evening close in. Who would think I was Mrs. Angel Clare, she said. The wall felt warm to her back and shoulders, and she found that immediately within the gable was the cottage fireplace, the heat of which came through the bricks. She warmed her hands upon them, and also put her cheek, red and moist with the drizzle, against their comforting surface. The wall seemed to be the only friend she had. She had so little wish to leave it that she could have stayed there all night. Tess could hear the occupants of the cottage, gathered together after their day's labour, talking to each other within, and the rattle of their supper plates was also audible. But in the village street she had seen no soul as yet. The solitude was at last broken by the approach of one feminine figure, who, though the evening was cold, wore the print gown and the tilt bonnet of summertime. Tess instinctively thought it might be Marianne, and when she came near enough to be distinguishable in the gloom, surely enough she responded readily to Marianne's greeting. Marianne was quite respectful in her inquiries, but seemed much moved by the fact that Tess should still continue in no better condition than at first, though she had dimly heard of the separation. Tess, Mrs. Clare, the dear wife of dear he. And is it really so bad as this, my child? Why is your comely face tied up in such a way? Anybody been beaten he? Not he. No, no, no. I merely did it not to be molested, Marianne. She pulled off in disgust a bandage which could suggest such wild thoughts. And you've got no collar on. Tess had been accustomed to wear a little white collar at the dairy. I know it, Marianne. You've lost it travelling. I've not lost it. The truth is, I don't care anything about my appearance, and so I didn't put it on. And you don't wear your wedding ring? Yes, I do, but not publicly. I wear it round my neck on a ribbon. I don't wish people to suspect who I am by marriage, or that I am married at all. It would be so awkward while I led my present life. Marianne paused. But you be a gentleman's wife, and it seems hardly fair that you should live like this. Oh, yes, it is quite fair, though I am very unhappy. Well, well, he married you, and you can be unhappy. Wives are unhappy sometimes, from no fault of their husbands, from their own. You've no faults, dearie, that I am sure of, and he's none, so it must be something outside you both. Marianne, dear Marianne, will you do me a good turn without asking questions? My husband has gone abroad, and somehow I have overrun my allowance, so that I have to fall back upon my old work for a time. Do not call me Mrs. Clare, but Tess, as before. Do they want a hand here? Oh yes, they'll all take one always, because few care to come. 'Tis a starve-acre place. Corn and swedes are all they grow. Though I be here myself, I feel 'tis a pity for such as you to come. But you used to be as good a dairywoman as I. Yes, but I've got out of that since I took to drink. Lord, that's the only happiness I've got now. If you engage, you'll be set swede hacking. That's what I'm doing, but you won't like it. Oh, anything. Will you speak for me? You will do better by speaking for yourself. Very well. Now, Marianne, remember, nothing about him. If I get the place, I don't wish to bring his name down to the dirt. Marianne, who was really a trustworthy girl, though of course her grain than Tess, promised anything she asked. This is pay night, she said, and if you were to come with me, you would know at once. I'd be real sorry that you are not happy, but 'tis because he's away, I know. If you couldn't be unhappy if he were here, even if he gave you no money, even if he used you like a drudge. That's true. I could not. They walked on together, and soon reached the farmhouse, which was almost sublime in its dreariness. There was not a tree within sight. There was not, at this season, a green pasture, nothing but fallow and turnips everywhere, in large fields divided by hedges plashed to unrelieved levels. Tess waited outside the door of the farmhouse till the group of workfolk had received their wages, and then Marianne introduced her. The farmer himself, it appeared, was not at home, but his wife, who represented him this evening, made no objection to hiring Tess, on her agreeing to remain till Old Lady Day. Female field labour was seldom offered now, and its cheapness made it profitable for tasks which women could perform as readily as men. Having signed the agreement, there was nothing more for Tess to do at present than to get a lodging, and she found one in the house at whose gable wall she had warmed herself. It was a poor subsistence that she had ensured, but it would afford a shelter for the winter at any rate. That night she wrote to inform her parents of her new address, in case a letter should arrive in Marlow from her husband. But she did not tell them of the sorriness of her situation. It might have brought reproach